If a theology tells you that your people are chosen above all others, or worse, that your truth must govern every nation, what do you think happens when that theology gets access to power? Supremacy becomes entitlement, dominion becomes conquest, and the harm isn't an accident, it's baked into the system. At the heart of both Hebrew and Christian traditions lies a dangerous equation: exclusivity plus power. In Hebrew scripture, that exclusivity is framed as chosenness, Israel as the people uniquely entitled to God's covenant, land, and favor. In Christianity, that exclusivity is amplified into universality, the claim that all nations, all cultures, all people must submit to Christ or be condemned. What begins as tribal supremacy becomes universal dominion. What starts as ritual separation becomes global assimilation. Neither system is neutral, both reframe political, cultural, and even military conflict as sacred duty. And when a claim to divine truth marries the structures of political power, the result is not coexistence, but conquest. Christianity is dominion theology. At its core, Christianity, especially in its post Constantinian form, is built on dominion language. The Great Commission isn't framed as an invitation, but a mandate: go into all the world and make disciples, teaching them to obey everything I commanded. That is not coexistence, it's conquest. The church historically positioned itself not merely as another community, but as the exclusive custodian of truth and authority, with the right to reshape cultures, governments, and laws. Even love thy neighbor gets subordinated to dominion when interpreted as a call to bring people under the lordship of Christ. This is why it so easily justifies harm. If the goal is to establish Christ's reign over the earth, then oppression, suppression of dissent, colonization, and cultural erasure can all be rationalized as necessary for a higher good. That's the DNA of dominion theology, even when Christians don't use that label. Let's break this down. There is the linguistic DNA of dominion. The language is clear: make disciples of all nations. This is written as a command, not an option. It isn't framed as a good idea for those interested, but a global requirement. The key verbs, go, teach, obey, are imperial verbs. They imply movement outward, instruction downward, and submission upward. This language mirrors Rome's own expansionist mandate: secure territory, impose law, and assimilate cultures into Pax Romana. Christianity retools that logic into Pax Christi. By declaring itself the exclusive custodian of truth, the church positioned itself above all competing truth claims. One Lord, one faith, one baptism sounds spiritual, but functionally it's a monopoly claim. If there's only one authorized faith, then every other worldview becomes illegitimate. This exclusivity doesn't just create a parallel community, it delegitimizes pluralism, meaning coexistence is never really on the table. The ethic of love thy neighbor could, in theory, destabilize supremacy. But in Christian practice, it often gets folded back into the dominion logic. The love is to save. To save is to convert. To convert is to bring under Christ's authority. In this frame, love is weaponized as an assimilation tool. What looks like compassion is actually conquest in soft clothing. When dominion is the non negotiable goal, then harm becomes reinterpreted as a form of virtue. Suppressing heresy equals protecting truth. Colonizing equals bringing light to darkness. Cultural erasure equals freeing people from falsehood. Even violence can be reframed as mercy if it saves souls. This is why Christian theology so seamlessly legitimized crusades, inquisitions, slavery, and colonial missions. It isn't a perversion of Christianity, it's Christianity's dominion logic playing out consistently. Before Constantine, Christianity claimed to be a persecuted minority with dominion aspirations but limited power. After Constantine, it inherited the apparatus of empire: armies, law, bureaucracy, and now suddenly its dominion theology had teeth. What was once metaphorical, Christ reigning in your hearts, became literal: crowns, swords, and councils enforcing orthodoxy. So Christianity as dominion theology isn't a fringe interpretation. It's the operating system of the faith once it left the margins and married the empire. But quite honestly, Christianity isn't alone here, and it seems that it may have gotten it honestly. Let's transition to Hebrew theology as supremacist theology. If you zoom out and look at Hebrew scripture through the lens of political sociology, It's also supremacist at its very core. Israel is the chosen nation, uniquely set apart from all others with divine right to land, laws, and covenantal favor. The Torah and later prophetic writings constantly reinforce separateness, dietary laws, purity codes, and tribal boundaries. These aren't neutral rituals, they're systems of boundary maintenance. Enemies aren't just enemies of Israel, they're enemies of God, which elevates political and ethnic conflict into cosmic conflict. It's supremacist, not in the sense of personal prejudice, but in that it presumes an ontological hierarchy of peoples. Israel above the nations, and the nations destined to serve or submit. So let's unpack this. The concept of chosenness is foundational. Israel is not simply one tribe among many, but the tribe with divine endorsement. You shall be my treasured possession among all people. That sets up a vertical hierarchy of nations. Israel occupies the top rung by divine decree. Land, law, and covenant aren't human contracts, they're framed as divinely willed entitlements, giving Israel a sacred monopoly. The Torah encodes boundary making into daily life. Dietary laws restrict table fellowship, purity codes regulate bodies and sexuality, tribal allotments and genealogies determine belonging. These aren't just cultural markers, they are sociological walls. They ensure Israel remains distinct, preventing absorption into surrounding peoples. Supremacy here is preserved by ritualized difference. Every meal, garment, and festival reminds Israel of its elevated identity. Enemies of Israel are redefined as enemies of God. Amalekites aren't just a rival tribe, they embody cosmic opposition. Philistines, Babylonians, Assyrians are cast as instruments or adversaries in God's drama. This transforms war from political contest to sacred battle, where victory validates divine favor and defeat signals disobedience. Once conflict is cosmic, violence becomes sanctified. Conquest, slaughter, and enslavement can all be rationalized as obedience to God's will. Later prophetic and apocalyptic writings expanded the horizon. Nations would one day stream to Zion, but as students, servants, or subjects, not equals. This marked the seed of universal aspiration within Hebrew thought. Israel's supremacy would one day be acknowledged globally. In other words, the logic of supremacy was already scalable, waiting to be extended beyond its tribal core. In the modern era, particularly since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Hebrew theology has been remobilized as political theology. The ancient claim to land has been reinterpreted as divine entitlement for a modern nation state, fueling settlement expansion, occupation, and nationalist policies. This shows that Hebrew theology was never merely tribal. Its supremacist logic provided the framework for nationalist supremacy, justifying domination and displacement in the modern Middle East. What began as covenantal ethnocentrism has become a geopolitical project with global consequences. So, just as Christianity universalizes dominion, Hebrew theology localizes supremacy, one people elevated over others by divine right, with rituals designed to preserve that elevation. Christianity doesn't emerge as a break from this, it inherits it and amplifies it. Paul universalizes Israel's supremacy by saying all nations must bend the knee to the new Israel of God. It's giving Game of Thrones. The church fathers and councils codify it into empire theology, Christian dominion over not just a people, but all peoples. What was once a tribal supremacism becomes a global supremacism. In other words, Christianity is supremacist theology scaled up into dominion theology. Christianity does not invent a new framework. It inherits Hebrew supremacist logic and then reframes it. Where Hebrew theology restricted supremacy to a single people, Christianity expands the category of chosen by making allegiance to Christ the new boundary line. Supremacy doesn't vanish, it's transposed from ethnicity to faith identity. Paul reworks Israel's chosenness into a spiritualized Israel. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. The Israel of God is no longer tribal, it's now transnational, faith based, and universal. This universalization doesn't erase hierarchy, it globalizes it. Now, every nation must bend the knee. What was once a tribal exclusivity becomes a worldwide demand for submission. With Constantine, the church receives the machinery of empire. The councils that follow formalizes supremacy into law and creed. Heresy is no longer disagreement, it is treason against divine authority. Christianity becomes an imperial religion with bureaucratic and military enforcement, scaling theological supremacy into political dominion. While Christianity scaled supremacy outward through empire, modern Hebrew theology scaled it forward through nationalism. The ancient covenantal claim to land was repurposed into the justification for the state of Israel and its ongoing expansion, producing a form of political supremacism with territorial teeth. Thus, the same logic that once drew sharp tribal boundaries has now been weaponized into a modern state project, producing oppression and displacement in the Middle East. It's one supremacist root with two branches. Hebrew supremacy is one people chosen, land deeded, outsiders excluded. Today, that is transformed into nationalist entitlement and state violence. Christian supremacy begins as a covenant expanded, truth monopolized, and all nations demanded to submit. And today, that looks like global missions, empire theology, and Christian nationalism. Both traditions, though historically divergent, are parallel expansions of the same root logic. Some lives are covenantal, others disposable. Some people are favored, others subject. One evolved into nationalism, the other into universal dominion, but both continue to generate harm wherever they intersect with power. So the bridge isn't a compromise between Hebrew and Christian thought, it's a theological escalation. What started as a survival identity for one people becomes a mandate for global domination when Christianity universalizes the supremacist structure. Exclusivity plus power equals harm. Anytime you marry the claim of absolute truth with the demand for universal obedience, the outcome is oppression. Christianity is particularly dangerous because it cloaks supremacy as humility. Serving the nations actually means assimilating them. Hebrew theology at least admits it's about one people. Christianity universalizes it. Everyone must submit or be damned. Let's workshop this. Exclusivity alone, believing you have unique access to truth, can remain mostly benign if it's private. Power alone, having political or cultural influence, can also be neutral if it's shared or accountable. But when exclusivity is wedded to power, the result is oppression by design. It creates a system where dissent is not just disagreement, but rebellion against truth itself. This fusion is the theological formula behind inquisitions, crusades, witch trials, colonization, and today's Christian nationalism. Christianity is especially insidious because it frames conquest as service. Missionaries serve indigenous peoples by converting them. Colonizers serve by bringing civilization. Evangelists love others by demanding their obedience to Christ. The rhetoric of humility masks the reality of assimilation and control. This makes Christianity uniquely effective at spreading harm. It doesn't always look like domination, but its outcomes are always dominion. So Hebrew theology is candidly tribal. It draws sharp boundaries, but largely admits that its project is about one people's covenant. The supremacy is ethnocentric, even if exclusionary. Christian theology scales up the claim. It transforms our God above the nations into our God over all nations. In doing so, it doesn't just exclude, it condemns all outsiders as eternally damned unless they submit. What was once a localized claim of superiority becomes a global mandate for assimilation. When you fuse absolute truth with universal obedience, pluralism becomes impossible. Cultures are erased, dissent is crushed, identities are assimilated, and difference is treated as a threat. Violence, whether physical, cultural, or psychological, is rebranded as faithfulness. This is why both Hebrew and Christian frameworks have such destructive legacies. They don't just permit harm, they reframe the harm as holy, which further preserves, perpetuates, and prepare others to do the same. So the real danger isn't just the supremacy claim. It's what happens when supremacy is universalized, cloaked in humility, and backed by power. That's why the harm of Christianity historically and today is not an accident, but a structural inevitability. The danger then isn't just in the belief that one people or one faith holds special truth. The danger comes when that belief is armed with power, when supremacy is enforced, when dominion is universalized, and when conquest is disguised as love. Hebrew theology drew sharp boundaries and declared one people higher than others. Christianity inherited that logic, scaled it, and demanded all peoples bend the knee. Both traditions, in their own ways, turned hierarchy into holiness and oppression into obedience. And that's why the harm is not incidental. It is the inevitable outcome of supremacy and dominion theology. Once you sanctify inequality, violence and erasure are not just allowed, they are justified as acts of faith. I hope today's conversation engaged your curiosity while providing some clarity. Speaking of clarity, what am I working on right now? As the founder of the LDD World Group, I'm committed to 5 global program focuses: community, commerce, courses, content, and cooperation. My program of priority right now is undeniably community with Bridge City Global. Last year, I launched our first Sunday session to start living the mission, sharing the message, and modeling the methodology of inviting people into community beyond superstition and without coercion. Since then, my channel has grown from barely 100 to over 60,000 subscribers, and Bridge City has become one of the most promising people-centric movements of the decade. People have been tapping in to attend, host, or lead local Bridge City communities from all around the world. I mean, literally from California to Kenya. And in October, we're coming together for the first time as a community for a full weekend of celebration and elevation. And I want to invite you to meet me there in person for this historic moment. Tap in and register using the links in the description. And let's continue to show the world that we don't need gods to be good. Wherever you are in life, join us on this journey to make sense of the world, make sense of your life, and make progress with others. And lastly, if you want this work to not only survive, but to thrive, consider making a one-time donation today or partnering with me monthly to ensure our community has steady support. Whichever route you take, the links in the description will guide you there. Thank you all for hanging with me today, and until next time, keep rising.